Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're talking about The Name of the Rose, a 1986 historical mystery directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud, based on the 1980 novel by Umberto Eco. And today we have two very special guests joining us again to return are Joel Christensen and Tim Gerolami, who requested this film, which I'm curious to hear about. So I'll start with either of you, whoever wants to take us out. What was your experience with Name of the Rose, and do you dig this film?
Tim, I'm going to defer to you because I think I dragged you into this one. Why don't you take the first swing?
I've never seen it before last week. It was a movie that I recall like it being on TV and like my older brother and dad watching it maybe and like liking it, but like I came in late, or I don't know. I didn't really get into it. Then in college, I knew like the SCA crowd. I feel like some of them either hate watched or loved it or something. I don't know. It was like, so in my head when we went to go see it, I was like, this is going to be fantastic and amazing. And then I started listening to the book and I was like, oh, it's going to be a Sherlock Holmes ripoff. I should check and see if that British TV show about the monk Sherlock Holmes came out first or after it or what. And then I never did. So I don't know. Someone else will have to tell me. But then watching it, I was like, oh, this is like not the amazing movie I thought it was. I'm confused. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Also, like they didn't go the obvious way I thought they would go adapting it. They like didn't lean hard into Sherlock, which I was like, why wouldn't you lean hard into Sherlock Holmes? We all know him.
We did get an elementary out of Sean Connery.
My dear Adso.
My dear Adso.
Okay.
Just one of them.
So Joel, yeah, you, I believe, are the germ of this sign. We should all be talking in signs and symbols and signifiers for this episode. So what was your relationship with Name of the Rose? Do you dig it? And what is the Name of the Rose?
The Name of the Rose is Peter, but I'm not sure about that. Right? But the book, in my sort of like knee-jerk request for us all to do it, has a bit of a winding path that's not like the book itself, but maybe appropriate to it. So the first time, so I've read Umberto Eco, for the first time in Italy. Which means I've lived a terribly deprived life. But way back in the day before ebooks, when you traveled internationally, one of the greatest questions for me was, how much weight do I dedicate to books and how much weight do I dedicate to clothing? So as a graduate student, I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in Italy. And I ended up there once with too little clothing and too little books. And I was on this train from Venice to Rome. And the only book I had in English was The Corrections by Franzen. And I read it. And then the train got stuck outside of Florence in a snowstorm. And at the time, I was also a smoker. And so like 5 hours into this ridiculous train ride, I ran out of cigarettes and ran out of books.
And one of the passengers showed up dead.
Right. No, seriously, there was a murder. There were 7 of them. It was the apocalypse. No. And so I show up in Rome. I was supposed to stay at a youth hostel. I go to check in. It's 2 a.m. I'm like, this, I'll go to the airport. I took the creepiest cab ride I've ever taken. I thought I was going to die, but I get there. And like when my plane leaves, I like 45 minutes before I get on the plane. It's like 7 a.m. I have one thing to read, and it's the Iliad in Greek. And I tried as much as I could to just focus on that, but I was exhausted. And the only English language books in the bookstore were a display of Eco. Right. And so I picked Eco out. I picked the Name of the Rose out because I had a vague idea of the old movie. Right, old at the time, a vague idea of the movie, but also someone had said to me in that current year that Eco, or The Name of the Rose, was the smart person's Dan Brown. So that's the line that I had in my head. I was like, okay, I guess I'll read this. And then I get on the plane and I'm reading this. I'm like, and there are long passages just in Latin, like there's stuff about anti-popes, which is awesome, and like just sort of fascinating, like if you care at all, dogma, like doctrinal disagreements among different monastic orders in medieval Italy, in the medieval world. And I was like, well, this is f***ing weird. what's going on with this guy? And then the book was like it's completely different from what we'll talk about with the movie, but it was really interesting. I hadn't read anything like it. Like, it was a weird little mystery. It had the action, the suspense, like all of a Dan Brown thing, but with much more substance. And it was just legitimately good, like in a really fascinating way. So I put it away, and years later, Tim, it must have been like after we knew each other, like when I was out in Texas, I think it was on cable one night when one of the babies wouldn't sleep. I'm up at night, I'm watching this. I was like, what is this hot shit? I was like, oh, The Name of the Rose, I'll watch this. I'm like, Sean Connery sounds cool. And then I watch it, I was like, this murdered everything that I thought the book was. And it wastes Sean Connery. And wait, is that Christian Slater? And then by the end, I was like, this is kind of unlike anything I've ever seen. So to answer your question, I kind of dig it. Not for like good reasons, but not for bad reasons either. As Tim and I were talking about when we were watching it, like it's a weird movie in like film history. It's weird for medieval stuff. It doesn't match up with the book. It's a weird position in Sean Connery's career, a weird place. Like, it gave us, and to a degree, Christian Slater. Like, it's just a truly odd thing that sticks out. I feel like someone could write a dissertation on like the evolution of film in the 80s and use it as a test case for everything that's just a little off. But I may be overselling the case there.
No, I think there's something to that where the 80s, like there's definitely a lot of things in the 80s movies that are just like people like making films out of books that like today would never get made, or like just people really throwing stuff at the walls and seeing what sticks. And this feels like, oh, was this a popular book? Let's do it.
It's getting to be the last gasp for movies for adults that are not blockbusters, that are still going to be a mainstream hit. And you got all that new Hollywood energy from the 70s, but it's sort of like, it's sort of being establishmentized. So I think that's partly why you get these experiments kind of things.
Christy, Eli, have either of you seen or read this one before? Eli's nodding her head.
Yeah. I watched this movie as a younger person. I think I was in high school, and I was very much like, what is this? Like, I was interested in history. I was interested in classics briefly, and this like kind of tangentially like touched on a lot of different things. And I remember being kind of like delighted and surprised by the end of just like, it's just like about a book of comedy. It's just about people wanting to laugh. And that sentiment is really what like stuck in my brain, and that I still held with me as a just, it's all this dark and gross and awful, but it's just about laughter, which is maybe not what I'm supposed to get from this story. But as an older person, as an undergrad, I had picked up the book because I was partially like an Italian studies major in undergrad. And I remember it was really hard to read in Italian. And so I have a copy in English that I've been kind of poking around, and it's so fun, but also like, yeah, some of it is so tiny little bits of detail about stuff that I feel like could build out a whole syllabus, like the politics and the theology and the dogma, as you guys have said. It's like, there's so much in here. And I know that younger me was bored by that, and older me is intrigued.
I'd argue that line of the movie is, did Christ own the clothes he wore?
Yeah.
Like, oh man, it's like a YouTube comment section.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So I think this rewatching it last night hit me differently. And I saw it in a kind of a different way. And it's very weird. It's so weird. And I really feel like I can't really pinpoint like who this is for. Because as a younger person, I thought it was for adults. And as an adult, I'm kind of like, did I enjoy that as a movie? So I'm in this weird liminal space. But I think I really dig this story in general. That's where I'm at.
Yeah. So I'd never heard of it, never seen anything about it until I watched it last night. So
fantastic.
Yeah, you gotta love me doing my homework last minute. So I had a few different thoughts. Like, one was, oh sweet, a 14th century Benedictine abbey. That's where Elijah and I met. and worked out
That
on
is
our first
true.
thing together. So I'm like, so on the one hand, it was really cool to, we've been seeing so much of Rome and ancient Greece. It's like, yeah, let's head to the medieval period and think about what that looks like. My second major thought was I love 1980s ideas of violent deaths because it's so much more. We've seen a lot of Spartacus and stuff recently, so I'm like, everyone's abhorred at the guy in the cauldron, and I'm like, oh, his feet are sticking out. That's kind of funny. And then my last and final thought was like, man, they really hate women in this. And because like when they were putting the 3 people up to burn them for being witches or whatever, and it's like, you so-and-so, like full name. And it's like, do you repent? No, that's
Yeah,
nothing
he
to say.
doesn't know or care about her name.
She's not. Neither does Adso.
Yeah,
Christian Slater never learns her
not
name.
named.
And I'm kind of glad it's like, I never even asked her name. I'm like, oh, good. We acknowledge that this poor woman, this only woman in the entire movie, pretty much.
The speaking part.
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten there was even a girl in the book. Right, it was so peripheral and marginal in the book that when we were watching the movie, like I convinced myself and then lied to Tim. I was like, "Oh yeah, this isn't in the book at all."
Yeah, I was like, "Oh, okay." I do think it was funny. Bit about the poetics and the comedy in this having none. I feel like the book does have comedy. Like
Yes.
even in the 2 hours, I've only listened to 2 hours of the audiobook. I'm still working on it, but I immediately could see that sense of humor and play in it.
100%.
I don't feel like the movie has a sense of humor and play too much, other than I missed the elementary. I don't know. Maybe we talked over it, but I think there's some, but it's nowhere near like in the book. Like the book, he's clearly playing with like history, literature, like modernity, like the whole opening where he like plays with how this manuscript came into his hands, like that there's at least play, if not comedy, in it.
I mean, that's just kind of it. As I was sort of like, looking into the book and watching this, that there seems to be kind of a miscalculation here of like maybe some studio exec, like, oh, it's a murder mystery and it's set in a medieval monastery and it's by a very popular author. And like, okay. And like they own, like the irony is for this book that's all about like signs and meanings and symbols and branching, radiating possible avenues of meaning, that like the movie only got the very surface level part of the book, which is like it's a murder mystery and a novel. Like it adapted the plot and nothing else, and like missed all of the underpinnings, right? The all of the semiotics that made Eco's work sort of so well liked.
Yeah. So Colin, what was your history?
So I had like thinking about it, like I watched it maybe not quite as weird as Joel, but I was first exposed to this in a very weird setting where when I was in college, I was doing one of those like work abroad for your housing kind of things where I was in Portugal and I was just, working on some dude's farm. And the guy who I ended up sort of like living with for a while was this retired Australian artist in Portugal who, like, in the sort of weeks that I lived on his farm, basically learned that he was a wild conspiracy theorist, and like not even like your sort of basic kind of like QAnon. It like went like a couple levels deeper. But he actually really liked Umberto Eco. And it was there that we watched this movie one night. It was like, because it was me, and there was actually a bunch of Italians staying with us too. There were all like these 3 guys from Sicily, and me and like a couple other people who sort of came and went as we were there. And this now I'm realizing is like deeply ironic that I watched this film with a conspiracy theorist, because like Eco himself has talked a lot about conspiracy theorists and how right, like the way conspiracy theories work is they attach meanings to all these different arbitrary signs and say like when so and so gets up at the speech and the Democrats say this, that means this, and therefore people are ordering pizzas and that means there's a child molestation ring over here. And it's like they like limit the meaning from one sign to one thing that they determine, which is the whole thing that Eco is about. Like, he writes a book about people that create a conspiracy theory from like a medieval grocery list. So it's funny that like, I was wondering, like, did you like understand Eco? But anyways, that was the first time I saw it. And I generally really want to dig this movie. This is a movie that falls into a category of like, I will defend it, even though I would be lying if I said the movie didn't lose me a little bit by the end. And that it drags in places, but like I so very, very want to dig this movie is where I fall on it.
Yeah. I think I read one of Eco's like interviews about his reaction to the movie, and he said something about this, novel is a sandwich and it has all of these things inside of it. And instead of all of these things, they've taken the cheese and the lettuce. And like that's what's in the movie. And I think that in a very Eco fashion makes a perfect amount of sense to me.
Yeah.
I will say, from not having been exposed to the book really at all and just having a very recent watch of it, my sense, it was really interesting because the allusions to like Sherlock Holmes and things like that, it was a story that felt oddly familiar. Like I would have watched it on my TV when I was a kid, and especially because it's from the 80s, and that's kind of how I equate a lot of older movies that I like grew up with but didn't understand when I was a kid, and then you revisit it. So it was really weird that I know I've never seen this movie, but it created this sense of familiarity with it in its storylines and tropes and things like that. So I think I dug it for that reason. I wasn't surprised or anything. It's like I had pretty good guesses about who did what when. But like it was comforting as a result of that. Like I enjoyed it. So that's where I came down on it in the end.
Nice.
Yeah, I think, Colin, what you were saying about the movie just being a slice of the book, as, that quote from Eco, I don't think they just made weird choices in sort of the content of the narrative. But like the form throughout is just a thing of its own. One of the things Tim and I were talking about was the medieval world it depicts is sort of a classic Hollywood version of the Middle Ages that really clashes with what you get in the book. Like one of the things that the narrator really emphasizes in talking about the abbey is that it is a Benedictine abbey. It's not one of the Franciscan ones. And he describes this opulence, right? All constantly, like with its food, the raiments, the decorations. And they shot on site in an abbey and then just sort of went with that whole washed out, like desolate version of the Middle Ages. So I felt like that was one choice. Like we just, it's a backdrop that has none of the play Tim was talking about. You can't even have a sense of play in the Middle Ages if you're just going to go with like this stark, everything's terrible except for Sean Connery's eyebrows, sort of vision of the world.
We also noticed that like all of the monks, there's a lot of monks that are sort of physically not attractive, we'll say, right?
Yes. This is a great film for like weird old guy characters.
Yeah, just weird faces, right? And apparently that was the director.
A Festival of Noses.
Yes, the festival. He was inspired by the village he grew up in. And he wanted them to look as ugly as the men did there. And he said this publicly. I was reading this, and like apparently the people from the village were like, "Hey, man, come on now." It's just
bad.
But like, it's such a strange thing to put in. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And apparently he grew up in, looks here, your hometown. Jeez.
Yeah, right.
Ron Perlman, they wanted a dwarf with a large head, and he died. And so then they got Ron Perlman. So it reminds me of, there's a spaghetti Western where like everyone wears hoods. Django, the original, the one that Django Unchained is sort of playing off of. And like they all wear red hoods, and it's like, oh, it's the KKK. And the director said, no, all the bigger productions hired all the good looking extras in the area. And so we put hoods on their faces so you wouldn't have to see them. And like, apparently like these guys were the same pool of people. I don't know. That's what I was thinking about when I was thinking about that story. It's Sergio Corbucci, but yeah.
Well, the edition that I have of the book has like some of Umberto Eco's drawings in the back. And they make me really happy.
They feel like, they're like rude caricatures.
Speaking of sense of fun right there, that's fun.
Yeah, like they're a little bit silly. Like when we're introduced to Salvatore, to Ron Perlman's character in the beginning of the book, he's very entertaining. Like he's fun.
I think I got a little of that in the movie with like, I feel like Ron Perlman was clearly going for it. And his like,
he was swinging big.
The weird like multi language thing was really fun to hear.
So fun, yeah.
So
supposedly he Perlman what he did to like, because it's not so much in the book as I understand it, but he got different translations of the book because it's been translated into like 80 something languages or whatever. And then he just like found all of Salvatore's actual speaking parts. And then he just lined up, like he picked like 6 languages that Salvatore's supposed to know, and then like lined them up and then just did like a random, like randomize the words. So like I'll do like this one in German and this one in French and this one in Italian and this one in English. Also another story about the director didn't write any of the dialogue for Salvatore because the director said if I'd wrote the dialogue, this movie would never have gotten approved. So Ron Perlman kind of was doing most of that on his own.
Well, that's I think the movie itself, like on basic like plot or content, is remarkable. Because could you imagine a movie being made today that was like 30% doctrinal debate from the medieval Catholic Church? I mean, that's wild to begin with.
Yes.
But then, in
Yes.
the larger subject that I think might be of more interest to general viewers is like where it sits, as we were talking before, in sort of cinematic history. Because it's just a couple years before that Sean Connery had done his last Bond movie. And this is a couple years still before he gets to be Indiana Jones's father.
Yeah. And The Untouchables is the next year.
Yeah, it's a weird point in his career. And I can't, I know Tim knows more about this, about other people they considered, but imagine just being like, all right, we've got a movie about a mystery in an Italian monastery, and the only way it's going to work is if Sean Connery's the lead. Like who thinks that's a great idea?
Apparently he really wanted it, and the list of people that they considered is insane. Michael Caine. Can you imagine Michael Caine in that part? Robert De Niro doing a sword fight with what's his name? Salieri, F. Murray Abraham. Yeah. Like, I mean, like that's what he wanted. De Niro wanted a sword fight. Like it's the list, and I wish I should have committed more of them to memory. But some of them you're like, okay, maybe. But like Caine stuck out at me as just like I can't picture it, especially. That's what 85 is this movie?
Yeah.
So that's like this is like right around when he did Jaws: The Revenge. Like that's not a good period for Michael Caine either.
No.
Yeah. On that note, I guess before we probably can get into the plot a little bit, but basically for listeners who haven't read or watched this, it's actually a pretty easy to summarize plot, but basically there is a meeting of different monastic orders in 14th century Italy, and during which our main characters, William of Baskerville, played by Sean Connery, and Adso of Melk, played by a young Christian Slater, arrive for this convocation to basically debate the poverty of the church. But when they get there, there has been a series of deaths at the Abbey, and a mystery which unravels to be about, among other things, a secret library containing lots of lost works, primary among which is a lost work by Aristotle on the philosophy of comedy, basically. And at the end, basically everything unravels and the monastery burns down and everything is lost. That is a sort of poor man's version of the plot, but that's basically the gist.
Yeah, it's weird how you can sum it up like that.
Well, I mean, I'm leaving out all of the arguments of like, did Christ own the clothes he wore, and did he have a purse, and because if Christ was poor, does the church have to be poor, right? What's the nature of the Inquisition, and rooting out heresy, and should laughter be allowed in the house of God? Because if we can laugh at anything, can we laugh at God? And then that would, bring about the end times, et cetera, et cetera.
I would say that all sounds ridiculous, except there's this huge fight over the Olympic opening and whether or not queer people depicted the Last Supper of Christ or not.
Yes,
it was not.
Right?
It was a Bacchanalia, right?
But as someone pointed out, NBC did a poor job of filming because American audiences did not get to see Bacchus in the middle or Dionysus in the middle. So like some context was missing. But basically there's a whole argument over what it was depicting and who would have Christ allowed at his table and all these. So like we still have these silly arguments today.
I mean, Eco maybe like called his shot pretty well.
Well, yeah, I think by focusing on the monastic differences, we may be missing on the larger picture coming out of Eco, which is the impact that these beliefs and debates have on the world. I mean, not to get too real, but people's religious convictions and doctrinal differences are having a pretty strong material impact on our world now. And so we can, so laugh about the difference between the Franciscans and the Benedictines. But at the time, it had political, religious, like empire implications. And so I think one of the things Tim and I were talking about the filming of this movie as opposed to the book was the context that it was created in, right? Like Eco's Italy was a very different place from the mostly American audience of the movie. And I think the interest in these doctrinal differences would have definitely hit his audiences in a different way. Probably making all this too serious, but still, I mean, it is a powerful way of demonstrating how these ideas, these debates have a serious impact on people.
Oh yeah.
I just took the fun out of everything. I apologize.
No, I think
also
that's what's
NBC's
so
coverage of the Olympics has been awful.
It always is.
You're like Jorge Burgos. You're just, we cannot laugh because it contorts our faces like monkeys and thus turns us into sinners.
And I think that's what's so much fun about this story is that it's talking about very real, very life-affecting things, and it's still trying to use comedy to teach us those lessons. Like they kind of have that entire interaction in both the book and the movie. I think he talks about one of the martyrs being either roasted and he's like, turn me over, I'm done on this side.
Yes.
Or he's like, my bathwater is too cold, and the guy sticks his hand and scalds himself. So it's like they're still making jokes alongside these really horrific things that are happening. And I think that so much to me is just very, very Eco. And I think that's where the movie kind of missed that opportunity to have the awful and the funny.
And even just the idea that like in a medieval monastery, like probably one of the most sort of oppressive and dismal settings one could imagine. I mean, that's how this movie imagined it. But like even in there's space for comedy where you have this illuminator basically kind of doing like Charlie Hebdo-esque caricatures in his works and people passing notes around, with Greek jokes and things like that. And that's like, again, one of the things this story is really centrally about, right? Is like the role of comedy and like, can comedy lead us to truth in the same way that can signs and detective work and symbols and logic lead us to truth in the way that William of Baskerville wants them to.
Or a library, not
or a
library.
Not to get into my professional interest. I was listening to the section on libraries and should they be locked up, and that argument's in the to some extent in the movie too. And it's such a guy I talked to. I checked in with my archivist at work and was like, hey, what do you, because she actually has unique items that she has to shepherd. They don't let me do that for lots of good reasons. But that sort of, it's more important. Is it more important that you preserve it and 3 people get to look at it? Or is it that, the numbers of people? And obviously in our world now with so much stuff, it'll be digitized. A lot of those questions are gone. Right. But, like one of my first library jobs is interlibrary loan, and pre-internet having full text journals. And I remember us getting a run of a Jewish newspaper on microfilm. And like, it was like, the rules that they had us follow. So the scholar could read it. But it was so exciting to get to get someone that information that they needed. So I wonder how I would do in such a locked up situation. And, but it's also like, it's clearly a metaphor for more things than just a library too.
And also just like the general tedium of like, you need to get something and it's like, oh crap, it's in the hidden labyrinth. So I got to go through all the rigmarole of the,
Honestly though, is that a metaphor for what it's like to try to find things in libraries, even without any hidden labyrinth? Cause like, sometimes that's true. Right.
Yeah.
It really is. There's realness to that. Like it's sort of a fantastic version of what it can be like, I think sometimes.
One of the big illusions in the book is the character Jorge Burgos, who's the blind sort of anti-comedy voice. He's the one who has poisoned the spoilers for a movie that's now 40 years old. Jesus, that was a struggle with
Don't
that.
say
I
it's
know, I
not
was
50.
like really worried for a second.
Younger than I am. So.
Yeah. Yeah. 40,
Exactly.
It's about to turn 40, but anyways, so he's inspired by one of Eco's heroes, Jorge Luis Borges, who wrote a novella, short books, or the Library of Babel. That's about an infinite library that contains all possible books. And, so we get a little allusion to that here. There's kind of a Library of Babel going on, which I love when Sean Connery goes into the library and he looks at 3 books and instantly declares it the greatest library in Christendom.
He was very excited too. So I'm kind of glad we came around to the library, because this is actually going to be our first episode of season 5, which is going to be archaeology focused. But it still really works because archaeology is so much looking at artifacts, and I think a lot of people forget that books and texts and literature are artifacts that we use to help reconstruct the past. And a lot of people, when you're teaching history to students, like they kind of forget what it took for like the people who originally wrote history or myths or things like that for us to possess it today. And it's a process that was very controlled, that for centuries has certain individuals making decisions about if a text should be copied and preserved or not. And I love that this movie is really showing that, like, very privileged few individuals had access to text for a long period of time, and they ultimately got to decide what we have today. So I thought that was really cool that was kind of a theme of this movie, because otherwise you don't really think about it.
Yeah, it's a movie about censorship, among other things, and right, and in the large, if it's about how you interpret symbols, but also who gets to interpret symbols and who gets to decide what symbols mean, which is again the whole argument we're having every day, in the news and tabloids and things like that.
Well, yeah, the Olympic thing you're just talking about is exactly what does that mean? What is that a symbol of? Is it a Dutch painting that's obscure to most Americans, or is it the most previously parodied and overexposed painting of Christ? I don't know, not overexposed,
It reminds me of this is going to be a weird left turn, but the ongoing debates every Christmas about Baby It's Cold Outside, and whether or not that's a creepy sort of date rape song, or if it's a song about sexual liberation, because in the time it was written, it was actually all coded, and she's expressing her agency.
And don't forget, you got to have the historical context person who goes, actually, it was from a musical. It wasn't a Christmas thing at all. And there's a whole response that has the man rejecting the woman's advances. We got to get that in there too. Yeah.
And all the, and I think I keep coming back. There's that meme of the expanding brain thing, and then it kind of goes through all of these steps, and at the end it's just kind of a crappy song, which is where I fall on it.
I blame. It's Elf's fault, right? That was not
100%. Yes.
I feel like that wasn't in rotation for years, and then they pulled it back.
I don't understand why people who's banging the drum for this song. It's and whatever. I'll save it for a couple of months
for the theory, but we don't want to take too much time on it.
Back to the library, because I think this is something that's at some level close to all of our hearts, so we wouldn't end up here now. I think that one of the big things you lose in the movie is the opening frame in the book, which has which is saying, it's a scholar who's been moving around the world. He's been displaced, and he found this manuscript, and he did a translation of it, but then he had a falling out with his significant other, and they ran away with it, and he just had this translation and hasn't been able to confirm it completely, but here you go. So there's all that level of play and the story within story. But in the introduction, he says, this is something this is a book or a story about love of books. Mm-hmm. And it's that sort of love of books thing that if you read into it, I think that's part of what you miss. You get moments of this in the movie, but the descriptions of the manuscripts and the genealogies and the lost knowledge and the respect for it. One of the things it's made me think of is the cheapness of our modern books, right? How temporary they are, how we don't treat knowledge and its purveyance and with the respect. Right. If anything, I think the books in that monastery receive more respect than the doctrinal debate that is occurring. These are the sacred objects. These are the things that people really care about in that world. And so when Tim and I were watching it, I have a pet theory that has zero proof in reality that Stephen Greenblatt was inspired by this book to make up all the stuff in the Swerve that became a bestseller. right?
Right,
Because
yeah.
I
forgot about
because
that
it's like
theory.
it's got everything. If you think about it, like there's a Sherlock Holmes character who's looking for knowledge, which just like maps on to some Greenblatt's story about this fictional character discovered Lucretius and changed the history of time. I mean, it's got all the same elements. There's discussion of anti-popes. There's mysterious monasteries and fabulous libraries. So I think again, like that's something that the pacing of a film isn't going to give you in the same way. I mean, I don't know how if we were to do a bibliophiles series of movies, like there wouldn't be a lot of them. Like how many movies are there about books? Maybe what's that movie with Johnny Depp? Is it The Ninth Gate? He's an
okay.
antiquarian book person, right?
Yeah,
That's the only other one I can think
few.
of. I'm sure it's out there.
Well,
I'm blanking
Joel,
on them, but there's definitely a few that revolve around.
Joel, you just kind of gave me a thought because it's like in the Hercules episode, Amy was talking about how kind of the more you read sort of Greek poetry, the more you realize that they're all actually about poets and poetry. And the same way that this book in many ways is just about books and like loving books, preserving books, what you do with books, how books talk to one another across, creating books that we know existed, but maybe don't exist anymore, but we can feel their kind of shadows and imprints and silhouettes in various places, right? He kind of imagines what Aristotle's Poetics would have been like on that second book that we know existed, but we don't really have any real copy of. But then the same way that like there's you say there's not a lot of movies about books, there's lots of movies about movies, right? Or about filmmaking or filmmakers, or the character you could argue is a sort of surrogate or a stand-in for filmmaking or the process. Like one of the ways to read Inception is that it's actually just like they're a film crew and everybody is kind of a different role in the film studio.
Yeah.
And what they're doing when they're like, dream heisting people is they're actually creating a film. Or that, even all of Nolan's films are like actually secretly about filmmaking. But that's the kind of thing. Maybe it's like the thesis is that the medium is always going to be about itself. And so the book about books maybe can't be adapted into a movie because there's a fundamental breakdown there. But I don't know. What do you think?
I was going to add that like that was the element of familiarity that the movie was giving me, because there was these different motifs I could pull out and be like, I've seen that before. So like when he picks up the scrap of paper and he smells it, in my head, I'm like, oh, something's written in lemon juice. He's going to reveal it over the flame. And my head goes to like national treasure. Yes. And then,
Yes.
The blind monk is like, I automatically think Tiresias, like even if, especially because there's some prophetic sayings coming about.
What's his Braun Perlman's character is in the Iliad, because his deformity, like he speaks, he's like against the leadership class and he's physically deformed. I mean, he's like right out of there.
Yeah. And the fact that the library is shown as a labyrinth, and the way Adso starts to navigate it is he gets a piece of string from his shirt to help him navigate it.
Like merits of your classical education or whatever he praises Adso's classical education.
He does, yes.
Yeah, so it was all familiar. Like I've seen all of this before, just not in this movie exactly.
And in a monastery in like medieval Europe too, right? Like I think that's what, like, he makes it novel. He takes a lot, like the lemon juice writing is in tons and tons of things, right? But like he makes it novel by changing the setting to like an unlikely place. You don't expect to find learned marks unless you've read, I'm going to murder the name of this, Citadel, the British series about a monk that started in 1977 who solves crimes. But anyway, the books. So his book actually does predate Eco's. But anyways, I'm sure it takes a long time to write a book.
I think there's a BBC adaptation with Derek Jacobi. I know Father Cadwell, maybe.
Yeah, I think I'm pronouncing his name totally wrong. I'm sure
he's like a Welsh Sherlock Holmes in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and it's like, priestly Sherlock Holmes,
But Christy, the part you're saying how about like, everything is kind of like an illusion, to use a literary term, to like something else. Like in the book itself, there's parts where like Adso will like has like a daydream or something, and then he describes it to Baskerville, and Baskerville's like, oh, that's like from this thing. And that like maybe he read, or maybe I forgot I wrote it, or I just like, it was like through the accretion of everywhere else, or like he's describing something and he ends up like quoting a thing he was talking about like a couple chapters earlier. There's stuff like that all everywhere. It's all it's all intertext. Again, not to start off your archaeology miniseries with literary theory, but
Well, I mean, if we're going to think ahead to the archaeology and the destruction stuff, one of the things I found really interesting about the filming of it is that the most genuine I find Sean Connery in his performance is when he gets excited about the books and when he tries to save books at the end. For the rest of the movie, it's almost
Yes.
like he's like, is this a Bond film? Like, is this silly? Am I having fun? And everybody else is a character actor, but he actually loves the books, right? And like cherishes them. And it made me think, and again, probably a little too dark here, but like we end up caring more about the objects of the books than we do about the human beings who get murdered at the end. Like there are a bunch of people, they get killed. And like, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe nobody gets to have Aristotle's Poetics too. Like, oh, the tragedy of the loss of comedy. And it just made me think, like, again, Tim, back to library stuff, right, to archives, to preservation, thinking of the time we live in, because that book's all about apocalypse. Like everything in the monastery is about to be the apocalypse. I was like, what do we actually worry about saving? In that monastery at the top of the hill where they're debating like human nature, right, and divinity, like at the end, they can't save the books or the people. But our hero is like trundling books out of a burning building.
Yeah.
And then Adso accuses them of that, right? He's like, do you actually like people?
Well, and he also, he says like, I think they like fall in a trap door or something and the lamp falls down on the books and Sean Connery's like, save the books. And Christian Slater's like, I'm trying to save you. So I'm trying to pull him out.
So Joel got me when we're watching it. Like he immediately made me feel bad because when he drops the first time there's a fire in there, I was like, oh, and he's like, you didn't care about the murders. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
You just caught me. You caught me in it doing it. It's tough. It's tough to we do value these things. And, obviously the people are unique too, and they're replaceable too. Right. But I don't know, something about, I always wonder if it's that the book, if you keep it, the book, as long as you keep it going, it can last forever, right? Humans never can last forever, other than in what they create, maybe lasting longer, but never forever, right? But I think that's part of where people get hung up on things like destroying ancient sites and libraries being burned and books being destroyed, is that, if you keep it, you can preserve something of that past. And once it's gone, it's gone. And obviously people, you can't, no matter what you do, you cannot ultimately preserve them as long. And I think that maybe that's the justification I'm going to give, but it doesn't excuse not saving people to save objects. But that's why, I mean, if to go to the Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, that book, which was all about in Mali, where the Islamic militants wanted to destroy all these books, and they had a long tradition in their culture of preserving them, and they did big things to keep them, to preserve them. And I think that's, in that culture, it's a little bit clearer. Like you're literally preserving, these things your ancestors have kept for thousands of years or hundreds of years in, the perfect conditions to preserve them, and they valued them. And you're trying to preserve that tradition and that valued things that once they're gone, you can look at those echoes, you can find those, maybe guess at what was in there, but you'll never see it again once it's gone. It's the stuff dreams are made of. To do you did a bad, I'll do a bad Bogart.
There's this Umberto Eco quote that's bouncing around online. I haven't checked to see if it's real or not, where he's like, a person, someone who doesn't read lives 70 years. Somebody who does can live like 5,000 years of other people's lifetimes and stuff. And so, the love of books and the appreciation of what it takes to preserve knowledge is something that definitely motivated Eco. And Tim, and not to beat on us, I think part of also what's going on, if we skip from the book level to the movie, is our habituation to the grammar of movies, right? Like one of the first things you noted when we were watching it is the inheritance of gore films in some of the scenes there. And I'd mentioned this to the movie to someone I work with who's like a 50-year-old British woman, and she's like, "Oh, that movie's really hard to watch." And I think I've gotten, like, we're post Tarantino, so nothing's hard to watch anymore. But Tim, at the time, like in movie history, I mean, like, it's strange.
I can remember when I first started my current job, I have a tradition of just ordering really obscure horror movies through Interlibrary Loan. I used to, when they were harder to get, when you couldn't get them streaming. And I got in this movie, 2000 Maniacs, which is like a low budget Southern. It's like Brigadoon if in Brigadoon Southern ghost murdered people instead of dance around. And I could go all about Brigadoon. I'm not gonna how it's actually a horror movie itself, but we won't go there. But I got that movie in, and my coworkers were like, oh, what is this trash that Tim's watching? And I'm like, you guys were just talking about how you watch CSI. Every CSI episode opens with a much more accomplished, gory death than anything you're going to see in a 1960s no-budget horror movie. It's going to be bright orange stage blood. And yes, I mean, it has a certain nastiness maybe that what you're watching doesn't, because they're going to show a guy get rolled down a hill in a barrel full of spikes. But you're not going to really see it. You're going to see a barrel roll down a hill, and then you're going to see a bunch of blood painted. Whereas you're going to see in great detail, graphic detail, the bloody death. And like, I forget what time that aired originally. Maybe that was a 9 p.m. show or a 10 p.m. show. But by the time we were talking, it was on, 6, 7 o'clock on reruns. It's just, I think the world has moved on. So that gore that, like you're saying, like Tarantino was your example. There's lots of stuff we've all seen. Spartacus, you were saying earlier, like way stronger stuff. But when this came out, I do think this is the slasher film and gore film, the slasher film boom working its way into the mainstream of cinema. Like you could see it in things like, again, these are action movies, but like Pale Rider and Commando both have little moments. I think they're both 85 too, where they just stop and they're like, hey, this was a movie about cowboys or action guys shooting each other. But now we're going to have a bunch of people get killed with like implements. And it's suspicious that, this is right after all these Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, horror movies where that's like the whole thing, so.
Yeah, like where does this is obviously like Halloween is like in the 70s, but then
78.
Like, Friday
the 13th 80, Nightmares 84.
Exactly.
So, okay.
And
that makes sense.
I'm a horror guy.
Well, no, but like on the flip side, like I think this in 84, you've got, I think that's The Predator, where Arnold Schwarzenegger blows up like 8 zillion like Nicaraguan commandos with like a machine gun.
Predator was 87, so it's a little bit later. But that's again, you're getting it's all seeped in. It's all been like it becomes part of films much more. I think. I mean, like there's gore, and it could just be that the technology to make it, the makeup effects required to do that stuff, got pioneered for those movies.
Or like John Carpenter's doing his stuff. Where those heads
I mean, the Thing was a huge flop, partially because people were like, "This is too much." Like and it got critically panned because it was too much. But like, it's still like the techniques were out there. People could then go, "Oh, I'm going to adapt this movie that has some really, a guy killed in a vat full of pig's blood or somebody thrown out a window. How are we going to show that? Oh, we did that last week.
Bringing it back to this, discussion of like, we're supposed to care more about the murders than the books. Having seen some hyper violent shows, the violence that I see a character go through, like I see an arm being broken. I don't feel for them. I almost feel my arm breaking, right? Like it's so focused on self. But like when a character dies because their story has been fully developed within the show, that's when you have the emotional connection to what is happening to that person. So I think that's why books can matter so much to us. When Sean Connery's characters, he gets asked, have you ever been in love? And he's like, yes, many times. And he names all of these Greek authors and stuff. And it's like, I understand what he means by that, right? Like you can have a very strong emotional attachment to the characters in books, to the authors of books that you don't necessarily get from someone else on the street, even if you see them experience pain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you were saying the arm break thing, that makes me think of Mario Bava, Dario Argento, the Italian horror director.
Yes.
He was always like, I like my murder. Like he liked his death scenes to have something that you've probably experienced, like scalding water, because everyone's burned themselves in boiling water. You know what that feels like getting cut, something like that. Whereas getting shot, I mean, hopefully you've never experienced that, right? Like, I mean, some people have, but the numbers are much lower than some of the other things. So it's like the idea of something that you can watch and go, ooh, I know how that would feel, only much worse, I think that's the watching it kind of emotional reaction.
This isn't quite the same, but for me, it always like gets me is when someone gets their throat slit. Like, and I think like the first one I remember was in Braveheart, but when you actually see it, that's where I go like, oh, and I like instinctually grab my own throat every time I see someone's. And the show that I'm watching for our recording on Friday has a lot of throat slitting.
It sure does.
And I'm like, every time I like kind of instinctually reach for my neck, or I kind of like do the thing where your chin goes down, and I'm like, yeah, that's my like trigger, for lack of a better word.
Mine is thinking about paper cuts. I hate it.
Oh, no. Let's not talk about that. In kind of coming out of the bloody gore, the end of this story does end with the library going up in flames. I don't know. I'm so curious about all of your guys' takes on, like, what are we supposed to feel about this ending? Like, it feels heartbreaking to me, but I mean, it's Eco, so there has to be something more. Like, what is this?
I think that, like, there is no, like, it's kind of, maybe this is a nihilistic reading, but it's all kind of meaningless because it's like the mystery is sort of revealed but never really solved.
Right.
There's no resolution in there. Stuff just kind of happens. The library burns down. It's all kind of lost. And I think the book ends on like a much more kind of depressing note than the film.
Oh, it's pretty darn depressing. Like, he goes back years later and he's like picking out bits and pieces of like parchment manuscripts and is like trying to collect all of them together. It's sad. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like it ends with like disillusionment and, broken faith and things.
This is, in a way, just sort of a classic Eco ending. And so I'm glad you asked about it, because like just as the original manuscript no longer exists, so too does the very object of the story no longer exist. And we're left in this sort of area of indeterminacy where we're constantly recreating the story and filling in those lacunae. I mean, in a sense, the movie and the book, they're like a moth-eaten papyrus themselves, right? With all the holes in it that are being filled in over time. And so I think like it has to burn at the end, because otherwise, all this stuff would be left over.
Right.
So it didn't depress me so much because you sort of got that coming from the beginning.
Yeah.
And in a way, maybe I'm going too far here, it sort of redoubles like any antiquarian sense of all the things that were lost, right?
Yeah.
Because Tim earlier was talking about how important it is to save things and preserve things. But those of us who care about the past and preservation are keenly aware of how little is left over.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Not to do the precocious child thing that gets mocked on Twitter all the time. But my daughter recently asked me, like, something came up about history, and she's like, oh, she had who was Julius Caesar from the library, right? And she's like, how do we know this happened thousands of years ago? How do we know it happened? How do we know it happened this way? So I'm, of course, like, oh, let me tell you about, the transmission of text, 8-year-old daughter, and she listened. But I do think like it brought me back to when I first realized that. And I don't want to say I might have been in college before I really thought about it, but it was like, oh, yeah, what you were saying earlier, people made decisions. Things were chosen. And then also chance. It's like a mix. It's a mix. And I said that as I was saying to her. I was like, there are some things that survive because they happen to be in the right Scandinavian tomb and they found it, in 1950 something. I think that's Menander, right? But like there's other stuff that we only have little bits of, and there's stuff that people chose to get rid of. And
yeah. And then we have a million Virgils.
You mock me a bit, Joel, but I like for my reaction, because I was definitely like, oh no, the books. Both times really just I probably reacted more. I'm gonna go with the Dario Argento sense. Like I know what it's like when books get wrecked that are important. No, I don't know. I specifically don't work in archives. So when I started in library school, I had friends who were like, "Oh, you should go into film archives. That's what you should do." And I'm like, "You want me to have the chance that I could accidentally destroy the things I love because I'm clumsy?" I was like, "Never, no."
I used to work in an art gallery at a college, and everybody has a story about breaking a piece of art. And like, this is like modern art. Like we could go talk to sometimes like, you could just talk to the artist and they can fix it or something, or, paint a new one or whatever. It's not the end of the world, but like we all broke everybody. One guy had a story about he broke like a $20,000 vase once. So you just like knocked it off a shelf. And the boss was actually very cool about it because he first was like, "Are you okay?" I think he like fell. He was like stacking some shelf and he like fell off and the vase came down with him. But
Oh no.
yeah, it happens.
So somebody who had the right set of priorities, is the person okay?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
As opposed to me, I get freaking
The
out.
archaeology,
Paranoid.
you have plausible deniability. It's like it was in the dirt. I don't know.
To shift things, because I don't want us to leave without talking about this, I want to talk a little bit about Christian Slater.
Oh, yes.
And that's because, one, I don't think he's very good in this film.
No.
But also, he's terribly cast. But also, it's the beginning of, if we were to name a period, it would be like the Greater Slaterid. Because and those who didn't live through it don't remember how he was almost an it guy. And I just want to give you a sense of the movies he was in that could have been great, but are just kind of off, because this movie starts like a whole period. So after this, the movie Tucker, The Man in His Dream, came out. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's about
He's
the
in
automaker Tucker. Yeah. And it is, I'm going to say this multiple times, it's almost a good movie. Like, it's kind of interesting. It's a period piece, but it doesn't quite work because Christian Slater's in it. He was in Heathers.
2 years.
He was in Heathers.
Yes.
And Heathers is like iconoclastic, but not because of him.
No.
Like, he's just there. He basically plays the same role 5 years later. Sorry, 2 years later in Pump Up the Volume, right? And in between those, and Tim, he's in a skateboarding movie called Gleaming the Cube,
Gleaming
which
the
could have
Cube.
been, right? Could have been the
Do you
most
know what
zeitgeisty movie ever.
Do you know what unites all of these movies?
What?
I've never seen a single one of them all the way through, even though half of them are like Heathers. I've never watched it start to finish. I've seen Massacre at Central High, which is arguably where Heathers gets everything from, but I've never seen Heathers.
But Tim,
I don't know
the
why.
Christian
Slater.
Weirdness isn't done yet, though. Because he's in in 1990. So Pump Up the Volume is a movie Tim and I have talked about a lot before. It's really weird, and again, a period piece. But the following year, he's in a movie Mobsters, where he plays Lucky Luciano. Like, he's supposed to be the central character in the history of mob history. It's awful. And right before then, he's oddly cast, I think, in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, with
He's Scarlet.
like
He's
Kevin
Will
Costner.
Scarlet, yeah.
Yeah. And then Sean Connery again shows up at the end.
Oh my God, he wasn't. I thought he was the Miller's son, because that's the only part I could imagine Christian Slater playing. I haven't seen it since 1991.
He's also in Star Trek 6, apparently.
I mean, all of this is a wild.
I think his mom was a casting agent, and he's a big fan of Star Trek. I think that's how he got into Star Trek 6.
But like, I feel like he's in a completely different movie than Sean Connery for Name of the Rose.
Yeah.
This is his third movie ever. And the other two, where it was Twisted, was the same year. And then The Legend of Billie Jean, which I don't know anything about.
That's a big cult movie with, like, I would say people that were in high school when it came out. There's a big cult following for that one. I've never seen it. I was not in high school when it came out. So there we go. That's I'm not that old.
Yeah, maybe I think I'm also just too young to really understand the like Christian Slater, the phenomenon and the significance of Christian Slater.
Joel, would you count Interview with the Vampire as a movie that Christian Slater ruined by virtue of being in it?
He's in the outer frame. He's in the outer frame, so he doesn't ruin it quite.
Yeah.
His character was named Adso of Milk, and he's interviewing this vampire, and it was very strange. But he's a framing device. But like, you could create a list of like movies where Christian Slater is the framing device.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and that's what's going on. No, but we're also forgetting. So everyone's forgetting he was in a movie with Marissa Tomei called Untamed Heart, where the whole thing was that he had a monkey heart. He had a monkey heart as a replacement heart.
Like, were you obsessed with that at one point, or were you just watching it on TV and I walked in? Like, I feel like I've been in a room while you were watching that. Back in the day, like you and your wife perhaps were watching it.
I just lived through the period, and the movie was on TV, and I was trying. Nobody remembered it. I was like, "Do you guys remember this?" And I summarized the plot, and they're like, "That can't be a movie." I'm like, "No,
I remember it." So I looked it up, and I've seen 11 of his movies, and that includes a Lego Star Wars special. And I've not seen most of the movies you just mentioned. Like, I mean, like Interview and Robin Hood and True Romance, and this are probably the big Slater movies I've seen. But I think I just like somehow skipped over it. I don't know. But he was huge. He was like in big movies and was considered a real star, even though he just basically did that like Jack Nicholson ripoff shtick. He wasn't doing that in this. That's what I was impressed by. I was like, he's not trying to be Jack Nicholson yet. He's
No.
you know,
he's too young to have seen any Jack Nicholson movies.
This was interesting, and I didn't know this, but when my husband and I watched the movie last night, and we were like, well, did they skip over the sex scene? Like, did they cut that out? And
Okay, good. Not just me.
Apparently they did. They have cut out 4 minutes of the movie that is on Amazon Prime or whatever now because Christian Slater was 17 when they shot that.
Yes. And
so it is no longer.
We watched it on Hoopla, the library database. It has that. We watched. They has the sex scene right in there.
So apparently the version on Tubi has the sex scene in it, and like the version I watched in high school.
The original still.
Yes.
I watched the edited version because I watched it and then I was watching something else about it and they mentioned that scene. I'm like, wait, was I like out of the room?
I had that thought. I was like, wait, I remember this weird sex scene. Where did it go? And
he was just buck naked all of a sudden and alone. And I'm like, what happened? Why is his clothes off?
That's crazy. That is, I had no idea there were alternate versions based on. I mean, it makes sense because I was wondering that myself. I was like, I think Joel. I was like, hey, that's a
body double. No,
body
he
double.
has he has to have a body double in that scene.
He's 17. It must be all body double, but maybe not.
My other thought with his role was like, on the one hand, you have one person describing him as very feminine and like beautiful, and I'm like, nah. And then
you had to be there in 1985 to understand that. I think.
Remember how ugly everyone is.
Yeah, I mean,
he looked clean because then they came around and Sean Connery's character was like, she would only sleep with a very handsome man. Otherwise, why would you have to pay for it?
I guess it is slim pickings in this 14th century village.
Yeah.
When everybody else has like a giant prosthetic nose and is missing their teeth.
Yeah, like one tooth, like
I don't know. I feel like I would have hit up the illustrator before he, jumped from the tower.
There were 2 hot monks and they're both dead now. So.
Yeah. Really unfortunate.
The illustrator was dead by then. Maybe she did.
Yeah, she might have. Who knows?
You don't know. He could have been her rebound or comfort after the death of her favorite monk. But
that makes sense. You know what? That's headcanon now.
I've made a backstory now. You got it.
Oh, jeez.
Has anyone the opening? I want to say something about the book opening that they didn't do, but the opening with the whole finding of the manuscript, it just put me in the mind. It made me think about that weird Michael Crichton book, Eaters of the Dead, where they have that whole conceit that it's a lost. And I'm like, I didn't get to it, but I wanted to look up and see, was there like a whole thing in the late 70s, early 80s where you had these like lost text novels that were like, it had a frame where they presented as this is something we found that's ancient, or is it just those two? It just happens to be that they're close in age.
More recently, The Historian by Elizabeth, I think it's Kostova, does have like that framing device, which I think they like is used really well.
I mean, it's a super fun framing device. Like I don't.
It's the only other one I can think of.
Well, this is
now.
kind of a bit of a pivot, but so if you've ever read Gene Wolfe has this like sci-fi series called Book of the New Sun. It's in the 80s. Like the first one was in 1980 and the last one was in 87. But the conceit of the book is kind of similar. It's like, this is a translation of this thing. And you kind of figure out, like, it seems at first like you're in some kind of like medieval fantasy setting. And then as the series goes on, you actually kind of learn you're actually in like a super far future Earth that like is getting visited by aliens. And some people are actually robots and aliens. But because it's been translated from like whatever future speak they're using or something like that, it describes things in like really bizarre ways where like all of the tools and clothing will use like very specific medieval terminology for like pieces of armor and weapons. And like, that's not actually what he's describing. He's describing some kind of sci-fi thing you kind of like grow to learn, but it's just like the closest approximate is this very specific, like French halberd or whatever. And that book actually, it's really interesting I really like that series, but there's a part actually like in one of the books where he goes to like this war front and there's all these people in like the infirmary tent. And one of them is actually like from the other side, and like this other country that they're fighting, the whole country is based around some kind of like holy text, and everybody in the country only ever talks and like quotes from the holy text. And so they're in this infirmary tent, and everyone's actually like going around and swapping stories and sharing stories and like kind of one-upping each other with, it's like very Canterbury Tales, where it's like kind of like telling a new story. And then that guy goes, and then somebody else has to translate, basically like he's like quoting all of these like scripture lines basically, but like what he means is this. It's very like Darmok and Jalad, to bring it back to Star Trek.
I was going to say.
I like that.
There we go.
Maybe it was something was going around in the 80s. Everybody was into, I guess semiotics was all the rage.
Sure.
But,
yeah. I like that this story makes us think about so many other stories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's like, I guess maybe, Echo 1. That's the book. The book did it, right? Art imitated life.
Well, and I was just thinking how this is going to fit in with like all the other archaeology inspired movies we're going to watch. It's like, even if it's not a book, you know, a lot of these early movies like Indiana Jones has the premise of finding something that was lost and having this grand adventure around it or mystery around it. And then finding it usually doesn't end well.
So true. Yeah.
And it has to get reburied or something, or it has to get or stuffed into an archive.
Or the treasure was the friends we found along the way all along.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's like this is not related at all, but I got to think some more about that, like what that means in the time kind of thing. Like I was thinking about how I watched a made-for-TV movie from the 70s called Gargoyles, which is like postulates that there's these gargoyles. There's a whole gargoyle. There was like creatures that looked like our description of gargoyles. They were real. They get reborn every so often, and humans always wage a war with them. And in the movie, it's like the last vestige of them is in the American Southwest, and they get wiped out by like 10 dudes. Like it's very easy because it's TV movie probably, right? But it made me think about a Doctor Who thing, which is the Silurians, which is very similar. And then I'm like, well, it's the Southwest. So is this Americans like not talking about what happened to the Native Americans, but talking about what happened to the Native Americans? And then the Silurians, it's like, is this a British colonial kind of anxiety where you've got this much more advanced culture that was much farther ahead of you? And you've found the sort of remnants of it and you've just destroyed them. And that's like, is that is it just these cultural, like it's that's what these things are really about. I just thought it was an interesting link. And I'm like, so is there something that was going on in the 80s, I guess is my thought, that it's like, you have to destroy the ancient object, or is it just that in reality we don't have these things? So you have to explain
Margaret
it.
Thatcher just made us confront our demons or something.
Well, I mean, it's there's a lot of American movies, so I don't know, the Ark of the Covenant and everything. I mean, I think. And then there's always the thought that, is it just in Hollywood, you always want to be the second person to do something first. So to quote a friend of mine who was probably quoting somebody else, but I don't know the original source, but it's a great quote because it's true.
Imitating life.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of what I hear, I'm thinking a lot about is like when Eco wrote the book, like it came out in 1980. It was his first novel. And in some ways, like, how does it change it if we really think of it as a Cold War book or near the end of the Cold War, right? This really sort of obsession, the exploration of truth and signs, the paranoia. One of the things Tim and I talked about was how does it hit in Italy where there's still an active fascist party and where Catholic monasteries and Catholic Catholicism is still a big part of the world. And so it doesn't change in the general things we've been talking about, but just sort of contextualizing it. One of the things I think I might find appealing about it now is how our post-truth counterfact period is kind of a mirror of the late Cold War, except we don't have like two sides, which is sort of, ramifying into so many different possible angles, like the library.
Yeah, like I'm thinking like a lot of 80s pop culture is like, fueled by the Cold War in many ways, but like a paranoia about like what you can and cannot trust, and do your eyes deceive you, or even something like, God, what is it? What's the John Carpenter one with the sunglasses?
They Live.
Yeah, like that, right? Where like things are hidden, things are not as they seem.
Total Recall. right?
Yes, total. Yes. Are
Yeah.
your memories fake? Right? Is
Yeah.
your family fake? Is your whole experience fake, etc.?
The one other thing that I kind of wanted to think about too was Eco was an academic, right? But
Yeah.
he wrote this book, and I think at least one other one, to be popular to a wider audience, which I think all of us dream about to some extent. And I was kind of reflecting on, in the movie at least, how this whole debate that's going to be going on about poverty and how it's between the monks, but they all, you can understand all of them. They seem really human, but then the people outside who are truly impoverished,
Mm-hmm.
like I don't remember them like speaking a language. They seem
They're like almost
subhuman in
they're
some
like
ways.
there with the dogs, like right.
Yeah.
They're like
Yeah.
rummaging around the garbage. And they're like the scene where he sees them in their little hut, and then like the chicken shits on grandma, and
she's like pulling lice out of her hair. Yeah.
Salvatore is more understandable and coherent as a character than anyone outside of that space.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what does that say about anything? I don't know. It was a random observation I threw out.
Is that dichotomy in the book that like, are the peasant characters, do they have language? Do they speak, or are they like this, where they're like almost another species?
In the book, I think they're similarly marginalized, but because we don't see them, I think there's a difference in form, right? They're on the screen. We see them peripheralized. We hear some things about them in the book. But I think what's different about the book, because there is so much of a recitation of church history and a deeper exploration of Fra Dulcino and the Franciscans and the problem of poverty, you do get more sympathy with the unwashed masses than I think you do in the film. We just don't have the time for all that church history.
Christy, you saying that really brought it back, the picking the lights off and everything. Like, it makes me wonder, like, this director also did Quest for Fire, which is about like cave people.
Sorry.
And I've never seen it, sadly.
You can watch it if you don't have time. There is a South Park episode that's kind of a parody of Quest for Fire, where Bebe gets boobs and all the boys turn into like Neanderthal cavemen, and they basically recreate the plot of Quest for Fire, or they're like not recreating it, they're quoting it.
Oh my God.
Have we talked about Quest for Fire on the show? I feel like I've mentioned it. It's this 70s cult film where it's set in like prehistoric, like it's in like the Paleolithic period, and all these Neanderthals, they discover a human girl, and she like knows how to make fire, and they go on a quest to go rediscover fire. But there's no language really. It's all just like grunts and movements.
That's what made me think of it, because like you're right. They don't talk. They almost are like a different. The difference is very stark between them and the monks. The monks. It's for all of our, those monks look like typical medieval depiction of what medieval life was like, where it's like dirty and smelly, and everyone's weird looking and has giant noses or whatever. But they're like even more. They're like they're not even civilized enough to not doing bodily functions in front of one another. Like it's crazy.
It was Eco commenting on the ivory tower. Like, here we are having all of these highbrow debates, and outside that is our view of what people outside of academia are, or something along those lines.
On the language thing, I mean, to bring up Aristotle again, like the movie, like one of the big divides that happens in Western thought is Aristotle didn't originate it, but the idea that basically like only people have speech, and they have this argument in the church where he says only humans have laughter and only humans have sin, and there's a whole big laundry list you can make of like things only humans have, and laughter and sin are two of the ones that make the list, but the big one is usually language, and then like having language is what makes you human, and therefore if you have language, you are sort of deserved of some kind of treatment and dignity as a human being, and vice versa, and things like that. And so by like not having them really talk at all, like it does kind of imply a sort of non-humanness, I'll say.
My favorite formulation of that is tiger gotta hunt, bird gotta fly, man gotta sit and wonder why from Kurt Vonnegut.
Any sort of final closing thoughts on this film that we didn't get to?
I was just going to say, my favorite line was, is it William of Baskerville? I keep being afraid to say his name. It's like, William sounds not.
It is.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, my favorite line was along the lines of like, if I knew everything, then I would be preaching in Paris. And I'm like, I kind of love that. So there was some humor in there that came out every once in a while, and I like.
Yeah, I feel like that was right after Adso is like, usually when you ask me a question, you already know the answer to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very, again, like classical, the Socratic method of like, questioning in terms of a pedagogy, and you're trying to teach this kid. And so, I don't know. Yeah, I feel like there's so many layers that you could unpack in this story that I feel like we could make multiple podcasts about it and still have more to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Do you save the girl or the books?
Maybe.
The nameless woman or the books.
That's a catch-22.
Like, he doesn't even have that.
Yeah. Do you save Sean Connery? Because every movie trains us to be like, well, you got to save the person, and not usually it's treasure, but if knowledge is treasure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Joel unfortunately had a power outage, so we're losing him for the final sign up. But Tim, did you have any sort of final closing thoughts that you wanted to be made heard?
I will say, I had a thought on my drive home today about, I actually went to a Catholic high school. We had brothers for our, some of our teachers, at least. We had a brother, William, who came up in the book, and I was like, oh yeah, brother William. But I guess like, I do like that they show, some of the humanity of the different monks in the different ways. I want to think more about this library and what it means, and the different ways it could be a metaphor for different things. So I think it could talk about, the research process. Like I was saying earlier, there's thoughts about saving knowledge, and like the movie at least brings some of those ideas out. I can see why the people I knew in college, who I think had a mixture of, they liked it, and they also thought it was kind of ridiculous because the stuff they were studying was like, yeah, this wrong and this is wrong, right? But I think at their core they liked it, and I think because it speaks to a lot of people interested in these areas. So, and it's definitely a fun murder mystery if you'd never seen it. Like you said, I think somebody said that they got the clues pretty quick. I did. I almost never solve mysteries, so I wouldn't go in expecting an impossible to solve mystery. But if you want to see an interesting variation on Sherlock Holmes in a monastery with some fun cast members, like the Ron Perlman, I had so much fun with him, because this is like early Perlman, and Perlman's always great in makeup and as a grotesque. He's brilliant at it. So that was fun, and I didn't expect it. So there's a lot in here, and I
had three sort of final thoughts on that I wrote down as I was watching. One of which we actually kind of covered slightly, which is Christian Slater, hot or not?
Not
in this role. I don't know, definitely not in this role.
I really hope he doesn't listen to this podcast. There's a chance he might, but the other was, what was the rat budget on this film? Because at one point I went, man, there are a lot of rats in this shot. And I was like, who's the rat guy? Because he must have had a lot of rats on set.
They apparently had to paint the pigs black because they didn't have historically accurate pigs. Pink pigs did not exist, and they only had pink pigs, so they painted them black. Sorry. Throw trivia at you late in the game. But
I love like what attempts are made to be like historically accurate, and what other things they just like.
It's funny where you get that weird kind of. We're gonna talk about this on Friday when we get to the what we're about to cover.
Mm-hmm.
But my other sort of closing thought is this movie. What I learned is you always need to kiss with intense eye contact when you kiss other monks.
Oh gosh, I forgot about that, and I'm like, you know what? You got to do what you got to do when there's no woman around. So like,
or if you specifically enroll into something because there are no women around and there are lots of attractive men, or well, not in this monastery.
There's one hot Greek translator and maybe an illuminator.
Yeah, and they were the first to die.
It's a pretty sharp dive.
Shame. You know what? I don't think it was about the book. Although, considering the one behind it all was blind, maybe.
Well.
Yeah.
I was poison pit. Also, don't lick when you're. Man.
Yeah, that was so. I mean, I get why it's there, but it was so gross. I was like, we were like,
every page, it's like full lick.
It's too much.
Very deliberate lick, finger raised on page, and I was like, I don't want to touch any of these.
There is something to be said for Hollywood. What an audience will accept as medieval Europe.
Yeah.
Yes.
versus that historical reality. So I think like you've got three different conflicts, right? You've got what should we put in and what do we care about in terms of historical accuracy? And then what will the audience accept? What changes to what their expectations of what the past is? Will they accept it? Which things will they go, no one ever took a bath before 1965. No one ever washed their hands before they touched a wounded person until that was invented. Like whatever it might be, they'll be watching and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. I'm not throwing any stones at anybody, but that is a question, that I think you have to wonder, and it changes by era too, Yeah. The classic is watch the hairstyles and women especially, because whatever era you're in, those hairstyles some version of them is going to show up in the past movie almost always.
Oh yeah.
I was reading a thing about this having to do with Shogun, the FX show, about how it was very sort of historically conscious, but there were deliberate choices to not historicize this. Like one of the things was that women in that era would often dye their teeth black.
Yep.
Teeth black. There was a whole thing about actually just how everybody would be sitting. And there's a whole thing of if a woman of lower status was going to be sitting in front of a guy of higher status, she would have sat at that period in this way. But that actually would be kind of weird for Japanese audiences, because normally in that situation, you would sit in this position. So they kind of sit anachronistically because of that.
Huh.
I liked that Eco also had to go back and make a few corrections to his books. And most of those corrections was moving peppers, like green peppers, out of his recipes.
Yes, the pre-Columbian exchange fruits and vegetables. Yeah, that's huge. I got fascinated by that in college. I took a class called ecological imperialism, and I got in a Latin American history class. Those two, I was like, that always fascinates me. Like what cuisines that we think of are not possible, and always in movies that's showing up, people eating potatoes in Rome or something, there's a ton of them.
Llamas at Troy. It's like the namesake of our podcast.
Yes.
Llamas at Troy.
I still say Herodotus would have been all about that.
And I'm like, I got to go back because I don't remember the llamas. I missed that.
I think they might. I wonder if, much like Christian Slater's naked body, they might have been edited out in later versions.
No, because I saw it for the first time the last time we watched it. So I'm like, there they are. They're really there.
You have to edit out the historically inaccurate llamas.
I had seen Troy multiple times before I caught the llama.
Yeah, same.
All right, I think that's a good place to end it. I feel bad Joel isn't here, though we have prior recordings of him, so maybe I can just repeat what he said before.
You probably could, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us. If there's anything you want our listeners to read or get more from you, or just anything you want to plug.
You could probably find me under Professor Mortis a lot of places, but I'm not very active these days, so I was glad I could get to be here and talk about movies. It's always fun, and it's fun. I'm glad to be here a second time. It was fun both times, and we
love having you guys on.
Yeah. Keep listening. Watching crazy and different historical movies is always good.
Heck yeah!
Excellent. Thank you again for listening. As usual, you can find us on social media at some variation of @DigMovies, as well as movieswedig.com. And you can listen to our episodes on most major streaming platforms. And we're starting off our new sort of season about archaeology, and this will be sort of kicking us off. So await more from there. Bye, guys.
Bye.